The doctor had just declared her dead. Her husband kissed his mistress. Right there in the hospital room. Less than 3 feet from her body. Then he whispered 5 words that changed everything. "We're finally free of her." The mistress smiled. His mother smiled. His sisters started discussing who would get the jewelry. But none of them knew the woman lying motionless in that bed could still hear every word. And what they were about to discover would destroy every plan they had ever made. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And if you are new here, click the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Her name was Dorothy Elaine Hargrove. 51 years old. Born in a house with a green metal roof on the outskirts of Macon, Georgia, to a father who fixed diesel engines and a mother who kept a vegetable garden even in the drought years. She had hazel eyes and hands that had worked since she was 14 years old, and if you passed her in a grocery store or sat beside her at a church potluck, you would notice only that she was quiet, steady, and genuinely interested in whatever you had to say. You would not notice the rest. That was the point. That had always been the point. The man she married 17 years ago was named Raymond Dale Hargrove. He was handsome in a particular way that ages quickly, broad jaw, easy smile, the kind of charm that works well in rooms full of strangers and wears thin in kitchens at 7 in the morning. Raymond sold commercial real estate for a mid-size firm in Atlanta, drove a truck he couldn't quite afford, and had the habit of telling stories about himself that were just slightly better than the truth. Dorothy had known this about him from the early years. She had chosen to believe it was harmless. That was a choice she would later examine the way you examine a crack in a foundation wall, not with anger, but with the quiet recognition that you saw it before it mattered and told yourself it wouldn't. They had no children. Raymond had wanted them in the abstract the way some men want things they've never actually imagined in detail. Dorothy had quietly grieved that absence for years, and then one morning she had simply made peace with it the way her mother had made peace with the drought, by tending what was actually there rather than mourning what was not. What was there, for Dorothy, was work. Specifically, a small investment firm she had built from nothing over 15 years, starting with an inheritance of $42,000 from her father's estate and a rented desk in a shared office space in Buckhead. The firm was called Hargrove Capital Partners, and by the time Dorothy was admitted to Emory University Hospital on the 14th of March, it managed just under $240 million in assets for a select group of clients who trusted her completely, communicated with her personally, and had no reason to believe that the quiet woman at the head of their investment committee was anything other than what she appeared to be, careful, honest, and exceptionally good at her work. Raymond did not know the full scope of what Dorothy had built. He knew the firm existed. He knew it was successful in a vague, unexamined way, the way he knew the house was well maintained without ever asking what the upkeep cost. He had never been invited into the details, and he had never thought to ask. That suited Dorothy. Not out of deception, she had never lied to him, but because she had learned early in the marriage that Raymond related to her success the way some men relate to taller buildings, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, and a need, shortly afterward, to talk about himself. The woman he had been seeing for 11 months was named Brenda. She was 34, worked in leasing at Raymond's firm, and believed, with the uncomplicated confidence of someone who had never been tested, that Raymond would leave Dorothy before summer. He had told her so in text messages that Dorothy had not read, on a phone she had never thought to look at, because trust, to Dorothy, was not surveillance. It was a decision you made every morning and either honored or didn't. On the evening of March 14th, Dorothy drove herself to the hospital after experiencing what she described to the admissions nurse as pressure, behind the sternum, and a heaviness in my left arm that doesn't feel like muscle. She was calm at the desk. She answered every question clearly. She was taken to a room within 20 minutes, which told her the nurse had understood what she hadn't said directly. The cardiac event that followed was classified by her physician, Dr. Marcus Webb, as a non-ST elevation myocardial infarction. In plain terms, a heart attack. Not a massive one. But significant. Her blood pressure dropped. Her rhythm became irregular. And for a period of approximately 4 minutes, for minutes that would later become the fault line through which her entire previous life cracked open, her heart stopped. The monitors flatlined. The crash cart was called. Dr. Webb worked quickly and with the focused silence of someone who has done this exact thing many times and understands that panic costs time. Dorothy did not experience those 4 minutes the way the medical team experienced them. She was not in darkness. She was not dreaming. What she experienced was closer to a held breath, a long, suspended stillness in which she was present but removed, the way you are present when you sit in a parked car at dusk and simply cannot make yourself go inside yet. She heard things. She was not sure, in those first minutes, whether what she heard was real or constructed by a mind under extreme duress. She would become sure later. That certainty would cost several people everything they had. Raymond arrived 40 minutes after she was stabilized. Dorothy heard the door. She heard his footsteps. She knew Raymond's footsteps the way you know a sound you've heard 10,000 times, and she felt the particular quality of relief that comes when the person you have loved for 17 years walks into a room where you have been frightened and alone. That feeling lasted approximately 90 seconds. Brenda arrived 4 minutes after Raymond. Dorothy understood in a single moment, the way understanding sometimes arrives not in pieces but all at once, complete and irreversible, like a light being switched on in a room you've lived in for years. She did not open her eyes. She was not entirely sure she could. But she was conscious. She was listening. And in the peculiar stillness that serious illness forces on the body, she became a witness to what the people in her life became when they believed she could not hear them. Raymond stood near the window. Brenda stood close to him. Dorothy heard the rustle of fabric, the soft exhale of a woman making herself comfortable in a space she had decided belonged to her. His mother, Constance, arrived 20 minutes later, along with his sister, Paulette. And then the doctor came, and said the words that Dorothy had not expected, not in those terms, that she had been unresponsive for several minutes, that they were cautiously hopeful, but that the next 12 hours were critical, and that in the event of another episode, the family should be prepared. What happened in the room after Dr. Webb left was something Dorothy would spend months afterward trying to find the right language for. Not because it was complicated. Because it was so simple. Because it was so clean. Raymond looked at Brenda and said, quietly but without whispering, "The attorney said the estate goes straight to me if there's no will on record." Brenda pressed her hand against his arm. Constance said, "She never did what was right by this family." Paulette walked to the small table beside Dorothy's bed, looked at the thin gold bracelet on Dorothy's wrist, a bracelet her father had given her mother, that her mother had given her, and said, "That's an antique, isn't it?" And then Raymond kissed Brenda. Right there. 3 feet from Dorothy's body, in the specific silence of a room where a wife is dying, he kissed the woman he had chosen instead, and he said 5 words that pressed themselves into Dorothy's memory like a brand pressed into wood. "We're finally free of her." Dorothy did not cry. She did not move. What she felt in that moment was not grief, exactly, and it was not rage. It was something older than either of those things. It was the feeling of a person who has been standing on ground they trusted and has just watched it give way, not in a crack or a collapse, but in a slow, silent sinking that makes the world they thought they were standing in simply cease to exist. She lay completely still, and she made a decision that she would later describe to her attorney as the clearest decision she had ever made in her life. She would say nothing, show nothing, and wait. 4 days later, Dorothy was transferred out of the critical care unit. Her cardiologist, Dr. Webb, was a tall man with gray at his temples and the unhurried manner of someone who had long since stopped performing competence and simply practiced it. On the morning of her transfer, he reviewed her chart at the foot of her bed and said, without preamble, "You are significantly stronger than your numbers suggested you'd be. Whatever you've been carrying, your body clearly decided it wasn't finished." Dorothy looked at him. She said, "Do you have a minute?" He closed the chart. He sat down. She told him only what she needed him to know, that she had been conscious during the critical window, that she had heard her family's conversations clearly, and that she needed him to understand, as her physician of record, that she had made no changes to her advance directives, that her estate planning was entirely current, and that she would be handling everything going forward privately and without her husband's involvement. She did not explain further. Dr. Webb did not ask her to. He simply nodded, the way a person nods when they have heard enough to understand the situation and are decent enough to let the person in it lead. "I'll note that you communicated clearly and were oriented ×4 upon regaining full consciousness," he said. "The rest is your business." That was the first time since the 14th of March that Dorothy felt something loosen in her chest that was not medical. She was discharged on the 21st of March. Raymond picked her up. He was solicitous in the way that guilty people are solicitous, attentive in bursts, overly cheerful in the gaps, and unable to quite meet her eyes for longer than 2 seconds at a time. He had brought flowers. Grocery store carnations, still in the plastic sleeve, which he set on the seat between them rather than giving them to her directly, as if proximity to a kind gesture was enough. Dorothy looked out the window the entire drive home and said almost nothing, and Raymond filled the silence with a story about a property deal he was working on, and Dorothy thought, he has told me this exact story before. A slightly worse version of the truth. She thought, I have been listening to slightly worse versions of the truth for 17 years. The house was a 4-bedroom colonial in Alpharetta, in a neighborhood with sidewalks and mature oaks and the particular quiet of places where the lawns are kept and the feelings are not. Dorothy walked through the front door, set her hospital discharge papers on the kitchen counter, and while Raymond made coffee she made a phone call from the back porch, to a woman named Gloria Tate. Gloria Tate was 63 years old, had been a family law and civil litigation attorney for 31 years, and was one of 6 people in the world who knew the full picture of what Dorothy Hargrove had built. She had handled Dorothy's business incorporation, her estate planning, and 3 separate operating agreements over the years, and their relationship had long since passed the point where either of them needed pleasantries. I need to come in, Dorothy said. When? Gloria said. Tomorrow morning. A pause. Then, how bad? Dorothy watched a cardinal land on the fence post at the edge of the yard. Her father had told her once that cardinals were the visits of people who had loved you. She did not know if she believed that. She knew she wanted to. Bad enough, she said. Gloria Tate's office was on the 14th floor of a building in Midtown with windows that faced north, and on the morning of March 22 the light in the room was the flat, clear light of early spring that makes everything look exactly as it is, without softness, without shadow. Dorothy sat across from Gloria and told her everything. The hospital. The 4 minutes. Raymond's voice. Brenda's hand on his arm. Paulette at the bracelet. Constance's words. And the 5 words she would not repeat again after this meeting, because she did not need to carry them in her mouth anymore. She had already placed them exactly where they needed to go. Gloria listened without interrupting. She had her hands folded on the desk and her eyes on Dorothy's face, and when Dorothy finished, Gloria was quiet for a moment in the way that experienced lawyers are quiet, not processing, exactly, but calibrating. Then she said, tell me about the estate structure. Dorothy told her. All of it. The firm. The asset base. The trusts. The real property. The offshore holding company that managed 3 of the largest client accounts and whose ownership trail, for legal and competitive reasons, terminated in a Delaware LLC registered under a name that was not Hargrove, that was not Dorothy's maiden name, and that Raymond had never seen on any document in his life. Gloria looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, does he know? No. Does he have any idea? He knows the firm exists. He thinks it's comfortable. Maybe $1 million, $2 million. He's never asked. Gloria wrote something on her legal pad. Then she looked up. Dorothy. The community property question is going to be the center of everything. When did the firm reach its current valuation? The first $100 million in assets under management came in year 7 of the marriage, Dorothy said. The growth since then has been almost entirely organic, client referrals, compounding returns, a fund restructuring in 2019. I have documentation for all of it. Good. Gloria wrote more. What do you want? Dorothy looked at her. I want it done cleanly. I want it done legally. I want him to have exactly what he is entitled to and not $1 more. And I want the process to be quiet enough that my clients are never unsettled and loud enough that everyone who was in that hospital room understands what happened. That's 2 different objectives, Gloria said. I know. I've been thinking about how to hold both of them. Gloria looked at her for another moment. Then she said something that surprised Dorothy, because it was not the kind of thing attorneys usually said in client meetings. She set down her pen and she said, I had a husband once. Not as bad as this. But in the same family of bad. She looked at the window. I stayed 3 years too long because I kept thinking the version of him I'd married would come back. He didn't come back because he'd never been there. I'd made him up. She looked back at Dorothy. You didn't make Raymond up. He showed you exactly who he was, in a room where he thought you were dying, and you remembered it clearly. That's not bitterness. That's just information. Dorothy nodded. She did not trust her voice for a moment. Then she said, let's get to work. What Dorothy did over the following 6 weeks, she did methodically and without drama. She continued living in the Alpharetta house. She continued preparing dinners and asking Raymond about his day and maintaining the surface of a marriage that had already ended. She was not performing normalcy out of fear. She was creating space, the specific, necessary space that allows preparation to happen without interference. She met with Gloria 3 more times. She compiled documentation. She organized 14 years of financial records, board resolutions, client agreements, and operating documents into a system her attorney described as the most organized evidentiary package she had seen in 3 decades of practice. She met quietly with 2 of her most senior clients to update them on the firm's continuity planning. She revised her estate documents. She had her personal assets, a beach property in Brunswick, a separate investment account, her father's tools, her mother's jewelry, placed into an individual trust that predated any marital claim. She also, quietly and without announcing it, had Brenda's employment file pulled through a contact at Raymond's firm. What she found there was not what she had expected. The day Dorothy found the irregularities in Raymond's company expense reports was a Tuesday evening in late April. Raymond was traveling, she knew that. She had the house to herself, the windows open, the smell of cut grass coming through the screen door, and a glass of sweet tea going warm on the counter beside her laptop. She had not been looking for anything specific. She had been reviewing a quarterly summary her firm's compliance officer had forwarded, and a single line item, a consulting fee, charged to a project she recognized, paid to a vendor she did not, had made her pause the way a misplaced key in a familiar room makes you pause. She opened the expense file. Then she opened the secondary file. She got up and walked to the kitchen and stood at the sink for a moment looking out at the yard where the last of the day's light was settling into the oak trees. Then she came back and sat down and looked at it again. She found the first discrepancy and turned it over in her mind. $1,400. Vendor name she didn't recognize. Property listed as a commercial listing in Raymond's portfolio. She thought, he handles lots of vendors. There could be a subcontractor I don't know. She kept reading. She found the second discrepancy. Same vendor. Different project. $4,200. Her hands had gone very still on the keyboard. Something in her chest had gone still too, in a way that was different from the stillness of the hospital. This was the stillness of a person who has been wrong about the shape of a situation for a long time and is watching the real shape resolve itself, slowly, out of the noise. She got up again. She walked to the back door and stood on the porch for 2 full minutes. A mockingbird was going through its repertoire in the oak at the edge of the fence, cycling through sounds it had borrowed from other birds. She thought about her father, who had once told her that mockingbirds don't lie, they just have a lot of voices. She went back inside. The third discrepancy was the one that made something in her go completely quiet. Same vendor. 11 transactions. Combined total, $68,400. Spanning 14 months. All coded under a property address that Dorothy recognized because it was the address of a property Raymond had told her sold in escrow 18 months ago, a deal that had fallen through, he'd said, in a way that had cost the firm a fee. She had believed him. She had said she was sorry it hadn't worked out and asked what he wanted for dinner. She sat in that kitchen for 40 minutes and did not move. She did not call Gloria. She did not pour out the tea. She thought, with a precision that surprised her, about every conversation she could recall in which Raymond had mentioned Brenda. Professionally, casually, in passing. She thought about the leasing division where Brenda worked. She thought about the vendor name on the expense report and whether it would resolve into something if she looked at it from a different angle. She looked at it from a different angle. And it did. The vendor name was BL Consulting Services. BL Brenda L. She looked up the full name she'd seen on the employment file, Brenda Lynn Caswell. Registered in Fulton County. Sole proprietor. Filed the previous year. She pulled the filing. The registered address was an apartment in Midtown Atlanta. She knew that address because Raymond had told her, 11 months ago and in passing, that a colleague had just moved there. Dorothy closed the laptop. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then she opened it again and pulled Gloria's number from her contacts. It rang twice. Gloria picked up. Dorothy said, I need to add something to the filing. Gloria said, tell me. Dorothy told her. There was a silence on the other end that had a texture to it, the specific texture of an attorney recalculating the weight of what is already in motion. Then Gloria said, Dorothy. This isn't just a divorce anymore. I know. This is potentially a fraud claim. Depending on what his employer's records show, it could be criminal. I know. Do you want to pursue that? Dorothy thought about Paulette reaching for the bracelet. She thought about Constance saying she'd never done what was right by the family. She thought about the carnations in the plastic sleeve on the truck seat, placed between them, given to neither. She thought about Raymond's voice saying 5 words to a woman who was not his wife in a room where his wife was dying, and she thought about how certain he had sounded. How finished. How free. I want to pursue what's true, Dorothy said. Whatever that leads to. If you had watched Dorothy Hargrove during those weeks and you did not know what was happening beneath the surface, you might have thought she was simply a woman recovering quietly from a health scare. You might have noticed that she seemed, if anything, calmer than before. More deliberate. More present. She called her 2 closest friends, women named Cecilia and Ruth, who had known her since her 20s. She had coffee with Cecilia on a Wednesday morning at a place they'd been going to for 15 years, Corner Booth, the same server who always remembered they both took their coffee black, and she told Cecilia enough to let her friend know what was coming. Not everything. But enough. Cecilia sat across from her and listened the way Dorothy had always loved about Cecilia, without filling the silences, without rushing to comfort, without making the story about anything other than what it was. When Dorothy finished, Cecilia wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at the table for a moment and then said, "You remember when I found out Gerald had the second account?" Dorothy nodded. "I was so ashamed," Cecilia said. "And it wasn't even my thing to be ashamed of. Isn't that something? I spent 8 months being ashamed of a thing someone else had done to me." She looked up. "Don't do that. Whatever comes next, don't spend one day of it being ashamed." Dorothy reached across the table and touched her hand. Outside the window, a school bus went past in the thin morning light, and Dorothy watched it and thought about the fact that there are people all around you at every moment who are carrying things you cannot see, who are making decisions in the quiet of their own lives that will determine the rest of who they are. She thought, I am one of those people. I have always been one of those people. I just did not always know it. Now, here is a question for you, and it is a genuine one. If you had been in Dorothy's position, if you had been the one lying in that hospital bed, hearing what she heard, what would have been the very first decision you made once you were strong enough to make one? Not what you would have felt. What would you have decided? Leave your answer in the comments below. People have lived versions of this story. Some of you may have lived versions of this story. And the decisions made in the stillness after a betrayal that large say something true about who a person is at their core. The deposition was scheduled for the 9th of June. Raymond did not know, going into that room, what the morning would contain. His own attorney, a man named Preston who wore good suits and had the slightly overconfident bearing of someone who had won cases he should have lost, had briefed him on the standard scope of a divorce deposition, the asset disclosure questions, the property division framework, the standard language. What Preston had not briefed him on, because Preston did not know, was what Gloria Tate had spent 8 weeks assembling. The conference room was on the 12th floor of a Buckhead office building. It had a long table, a court reporter, for chairs, a window facing east, and light the color of old honey coming through the glass at 9 in the morning. Raymond came in looking the way Raymond always looked, put together, composed, carrying that easy smile like a tool he kept in his shirt pocket. He nodded at Dorothy. She nodded back. She looked at him the way you look at a landscape you are seeing for the last time, not with sadness exactly, but with the deliberate attention of someone making a memory they intend to keep clearly. Gloria began with the standard questions. Assets. Income. Business interests. Raymond answered smoothly. Then Gloria placed a document on the table and slid it across to Preston, who looked at it, and whose expression shifted in a way that Raymond noticed and did not understand. "Mr. Hargrove," Gloria said. "I'd like to direct your attention to the expense records from your firm's commercial division, specifically the 14 months between January of last year and February of this year." Raymond looked at the document. Something changed in the set of his jaw. Not fear yet. Something more like recalibration, the expression of a man who has just realized the room he walked into is not the room he expected. "Do you recognize the vendor listed as BL Consulting Services on these expense reports?" A pause. "It's a subcontractor we used on a few listings." "Can you describe the services rendered?" Another pause. Longer. "Market analysis. Research support. Are you aware that BL Consulting Services is a sole proprietorship registered to Brenda Lynn Caswell, an employee of your firm, at her personal residential address? The room went the specific quiet that rooms go when a fact lands that cannot be taken back. Preston said, "I'd like a moment with my client." Gloria said, "Of course." Dorothy looked at the window. The light had not changed. Outside, somewhere, the city was going about its Tuesday. She thought about the screen door at her parents' house, the particular sound it made closing behind you in summer, a sound so ordinary, so specifically hers, that she could call it up in complete detail at any moment. She thought about how much of a life is made of sounds like that. Sounds you don't know you're keeping until one day you reach for them and find them exactly where you left them. The deposition resumed. It ran for 3 more hours. By the end of it, Preston had stopped objecting. Raymond had stopped performing. And the transcript that the court reporter sealed into the record that afternoon contained, in Raymond's own words, enough to support not only the divorce proceedings but a formal referral to his employer's internal ethics board and, eventually, the Fulton County District Attorney's Office. He was placed on administrative leave from the firm 12 days later. The 30 days between the deposition and the settlement agreement were the hardest. Dorothy did not expect them to be. She had expected the legal process to be the hard part. It had not been. The hard part was the Tuesday afternoons. The specific quality of a house in the late afternoon when you have lived in it with another person for 16 years and are living in it alone for the first time. The way certain sounds, a truck on the road outside, the particular pitch of the refrigerator's hum, had attached themselves to a version of her life that no longer existed. She sat in the kitchen one evening in early July with the windows open and a letter from her firm's senior client on the table in front of her, a handwritten note, 3 paragraphs, that had arrived that day. The client, a man in his 70s named Harold Brentwood, who had trusted Dorothy with his family's estate for 11 years, wrote, "I have always said that the measure of a person is not what they do when things are easy. It is what they choose to do when the ground shifts. You have never been anything other than steady. That is the rarest thing." Dorothy read it twice. Then she folded it and placed it in the drawer where she kept things she intended to carry forward. Here is the second question this story asks. At what point does a person stop being a victim of what was done to them and start being the author of what comes next? Because Raymond Hargrove did not simply cheat on his wife. He counted her out. He calculated, in the specific silence of a hospital room, that her disappearance would be a relief, a clearing. And the question that Dorothy's story puts on the table is one that many of us, if we are honest, have had to ask ourselves in different rooms, about different people. What do we owe to someone who made a promise to us and broke it not in a moment of weakness but in a moment of clarity? What does the person holding the broken promise owe to themselves? We would genuinely like to know what you think. Tell us in the comments. The settlement was finalized on July 19. Raymond received what he was legally entitled to receive from the community property accrued during the marriage. A number that, against the full landscape of what Dorothy had built, was a fraction. His attorney had argued for more. Gloria had placed, methodically, the documentation of Brenda's consulting fraud on the table, and the number had stopped moving. Raymond signed the agreement in a conference room very similar to the one where he had been deposed, and he looked across the table at Dorothy before he signed it, and he said, with a quality in his voice that Dorothy had not heard before, something stripped of the performance, something actual, "You could have destroyed me." Dorothy looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I know." He waited, as if there was more coming. There was not. She had already said everything she needed to say to Raymond Hargrove, and she had said it by doing exactly what she'd done, and it was finished. The Ethics Board referral resulted in Raymond's termination. The district attorney's office opened a preliminary inquiry into the consulting fraud. Brenda Caswell was interviewed as part of that inquiry and was subsequently dismissed from the firm. The bracelet that Paulette had reached for in the hospital room was on Dorothy's wrist on the day the settlement was signed, and she noticed it as she stood at the elevator afterward, and she pressed her thumb against the edge of it, the specific, worn smooth edge that her mother had pressed 10,000 times before her, and she thought about what it meant to carry something that belonged to a person who had loved you truly and completely, and how that was a different thing entirely from carrying a weight. Constance Hargrove called Dorothy once, about a week after the settlement. Dorothy did not answer. She listened to the voicemail later, standing in the kitchen in the early morning, and the voicemail was what she had expected, some version of the belief that Dorothy had been too extreme, too harsh, that family should have been considered. Dorothy deleted it without replaying it. Not in anger. In the same spirit in which she had, over the preceding months, been very deliberate about what she chose to carry forward. What Dorothy chose to carry forward, she thought about with genuine care. Not in one sitting but over weeks, the way you sort through a house, room by room, object by object, deciding what has earned its place in the next life you are building. She carried forward the firm, which she had renamed quietly, no longer Hargrove Capital Partners but Elaine Capital Partners, her middle name, her mother's name, the name on the deed to the green-roofed house in Macon where she had been born. She carried forward Cecilia and Ruth. She carried forward Harold Brentwood's letter in the kitchen drawer. She carried forward the habit of the vegetable garden, which she had let go of for years and reclaimed that summer, planting tomatoes and squash in raised beds along the south wall of the yard, watering them in the early morning the way her mother had, in the drought years, when keeping things alive was an act of deliberate belief rather than easy abundance. What she left behind completely. She sold the Alpharetta house in September. She bought a smaller house 40 minutes outside the city, on a gravel road, with an oak in the front yard and a porch that faced west. She sat on that porch the evening she moved in, as the light fell in long red and orange stripes through the trees, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, something she had trouble naming at first because it was so quiet and because it came with no particular story attached to it. It was something like relief. But deeper than that. It was something like the feeling of finally standing on ground that was actually there. Before the final consequences arrived, and they did arrive, the DA's office concluded its inquiry, Raymond entered a plea agreement related to the fraud charges, and the firm that had employed him for 14 years closed its commercial division amid the fallout. Dorothy had one more conversation that mattered. She called her mother's oldest friend, a woman named Eleanor, who was 81 and still lived in Macon, 2 streets from where Dorothy had grown up. She had not spoken to Eleanor in over a year, and she called her on a Thursday evening in August while sitting on the porch of the new house with the oak tree going dark against the sky. Eleanor picked up on the second ring, and her voice was exactly as Dorothy remembered it, the same voice that had sat at her mother's kitchen table for 40 years, that had argued over recipes and prayed at bedsides and laughed the way people laugh when they have been through enough to understand that laughing is not a betrayal of seriousness but its necessary companion. "Dorothy Elaine," Eleanor said. "I was just thinking about you." "Were you?" Dorothy said. "I was thinking you were due to come see me." A pause. "How are you, baby?" Dorothy looked at the tree. She thought about what she wanted to say and then she said the thing she had been thinking for months but had only previously carried in the quiet of her own mind. "I think I'm okay, Eleanor," she said. "I really think I am. And I don't mean that in the way people say it when they're not. I mean it in the way that feels strange because it's actually true." "Strange how?" "Strange like, I thought being okay was going to feel like going back to something. Like recovering a version of things that I'd had before. And it doesn't feel like that at all." She paused. "It feels like something different. Something I don't have a name for yet." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your mama used to say that the person you become on the other side of a hard thing has never existed before. She said it takes time to get acquainted with them." A breath. "She was right about most things, your mama." Dorothy put her hand on the porch rail. The wood was warm from the day's heat, still holding it. "I know she was," she said. "Now here is the final question this story carries, and we want you to sit with it for a moment before you answer. The people who were in that hospital room, Raymond, Brenda, Constance, Paulette, each of them faced consequences. Legal ones, professional ones, relational ones. And yet here is what we want to ask, does consequence, even when it is proportionate, even when it is earned, even when it arrives cleanly and without drama, does it actually make things even? Does the person who was harmed ever receive back the exact thing that was taken? Or do they simply, eventually, build something new on the ground where the old thing stood? Tell us what you believe in the comments. Because that question does not have one answer. It has as many answers as there are people who have ever had to ask it. In the first days after the settlement was finalized, Dorothy noticed that the silence of her life had changed its character. For 17 years, the silence of her house had been a particular kind of silence, the silence of a person who has been alone in the presence of another person, which is the loneliest kind of quiet there is. The silence of the new house was different. It was simply silence. It was hers. It did not carry the specific weight of things unsaid in the direction of another person. It was just the refrigerator's hum and the sound of wind in the oak and the occasional gravel truck on the road outside, and she found, in the weeks after she moved in, that she was sleeping more deeply than she had in years. There was a morning in mid-October, about 3 weeks after she'd settled in, when she was in the garden in the early light, pulling the last of the summer squash before the first cold came, and her hands were in the dirt and the air had that first faint edge to it that tells you the season is about to shift, and she thought about her father. She thought about the way he could fix a diesel engine in the dark of a garage and hum to himself while he did it, without self-consciousness, without needing the work to be witnessed. She thought, that is the thing I want to carry. Not the story of what was done. Not even the story of what I did about it. The thing underneath all of it, the ability to hum to yourself in the dark of a garage while you fix something broken, not because anyone is watching, but because the work itself is worth doing. She called Cecilia that afternoon and told her she was coming to the city the following week. Cecilia said, "Corner booth," and Dorothy said, "Corner booth." And when she hung up she felt something she had not allowed herself to feel in months, something she recognized as simply being glad. Glad to have a friend who had known her long enough to know what corner booth meant without explanation. Glad to be the kind of person who had built that. Glad to still be here to use it. There is something this story asks you to hold before it ends. Not a lesson. Not a verdict. Something quieter than that. Dorothy Hargrove lay in a hospital bed and heard the people closest to her reveal who they were in the absence of consequence. And what she did with that information was not what most people would have predicted, including, she would tell you, herself. She did not explode. She did not collapse. She did not become a version of herself shaped entirely by what had been done to her. She became, instead, more fully herself, more deliberate, more clear, more rooted in the specific things that had always been true about her and that no one's betrayal had the power to take away. We are not asking you to admire that. Admiration is too easy and too distant. We are asking you to recognize it. Because the truth this story carries is not about revenge, and it is not about justice, though justice arrived. It is about what a person finds out about their own capacity when the ground gives way completely. And what Dorothy found, what so many people find, in the versions of this story that happen quietly in real lives, in real kitchens, in real hospital rooms, in real corners of the country, is that the capacity was always there. It was not built in the crisis. It was only uncovered by it. The things that are most truly yours cannot be taken from you in a hospital room. They cannot be taken by a signature on a settlement agreement or a kiss shared 3 feet from your body by people who had already decided you were finished. The things that are most truly yours are the ones that remain when everything that was never really yours has been removed. Dorothy Elaine Hargrove lost a marriage, a house, 17 years of a story she had believed in. What she found on the other side of that loss was herself, unhurried, clear-eyed, planting tomatoes in the early morning, sitting on a porch that faced west, carrying her mother's bracelet on her wrist, alive in a way that had nothing to do with the monitors in a hospital room and everything to do with the decision she made, in 4 minutes of terrible stillness, to keep going. If this story moved you, if it made you think of someone you know or something you have lived, leave us a comment. Tell us where you are watching from. Tell us what Dorothy's story brought up for you. We read every comment, and we are grateful that you chose to spend this hour with us. If you are new to this channel, please subscribe. We have more stories coming, stories about real people, real choices, real consequences, and the quiet kind of strength that doesn't announce itself but holds everything up. We will see you in the next one.